After the killing of 5,731 human children, the Emperor finally heard humanity's reply. The Calvari did not announce themselves. That was the first thing historians would note, decades later, when they tried to make sense of how a species capable of interstellar travel had initiated contact through destruction rather than dialogue. There were no radio signals, no mathematical sequences broadcast across the void, no careful approach designed to minimize alarm. The Calvari simply arrived, and they arrived over Rethka. Rethka was not a military installation. That point cannot be overstated. It was a colonial settlement on the moon of Varan 4, in the outer band of the Kashan Expanse, one of humanity's quieter frontier posts. Roughly 11,000 residents. Miners, agricultural technicians, educators, families. The kind of settlement that existed in the margins of human expansion, not because anyone had sent soldiers there, but because people simply went where there was work and room to breathe. The Calvari fleet entered the system at 0347 Standard Colonial Time. Fleet is perhaps too grand a word for what it was, though it didn't feel small to the people on the surface. 14 vessels of unknown configuration. Long-haul craft, deep space capable, with hull geometries that suggested efficiency over aesthetics. Practical ships, not ceremonial ones. The Rethka Colonial Authority detected them on long-range passive sensors nearly 6 hours before the ships achieved orbital insertion. And in those 6 hours, every protocol humanity had ever written for first contact was attempted. Broadcasts on every agreed-upon international frequency. Mathematical sequences. The Linkos framework, developed in the mid-21st century and updated twice since. Light signals. Gravitational wave pulses. Every tool in the contact toolkit, deployed in sequence, with careful spacing to avoid overwhelming any hypothetical receiver. The Calvari did not respond. Not to silence them. Not because they were unaware. Later analysis of the fleet's electromagnetic profile would show that their sensors were fully active and had been since system entry. They heard everything. They simply chose not to answer. At 1,423 hours, the lead vessel achieved low orbit over Rethka's primary settlement cluster and began what the subsequent UN Space Command inquiry would describe as an unambiguous weapons deployment. Not a warning shot. Not a targeted strike against infrastructure. The energy discharge that swept across the settlement's northern agricultural zone killed 312 people in under 4 minutes. Mostly children attending a morning class rotation, because the school buildings were in the northern zone, because that was where the community had built them, close to the farms, close to the growing things. The colonial authorities' emergency transmission reached Earth 17 hours later. By then the fleet had already moved. What happened in the weeks that followed is a matter of documented record, though the documentation is clinical in a way that strips the events of their true weight. The Calvari fleet did not stay to observe what they had done. They left the Rethka system, transited to 3 other colonial installations in the Kashan Expanse, and repeated the same action with the same apparent methodology. Orbital insertion, sensor sweep, weapons discharge, departure. No demands. No communication. No pattern that analysts could immediately explain. The second settlement was Marin's Crossing. 847 dead. Mostly elderly residents and the young families that had moved there specifically for the slower pace of life. The third was Port 7, an industrial installation. 1,104 dead, including the entire staff of a pediatric medical unit that had been operating on reduced power due to a routine maintenance window. The fourth was the Draker Agricultural Station, which had no defense capability at all and a population of 203. After Draker, the fleet disappeared into deep transit. Total confirmed dead across 4 sites, 2,466 human beings. Among them, 1,891 were children under the age of 14. The UN Space Command convened an emergency session within 48 hours of the final confirmed transmission from Draker. The session lasted 11 days. It was not panicked. The people in that room, admirals, strategic analysts, xenolinguists, civilian oversight representatives, were professionals who had spent careers preparing for the possibility of non-terrestrial contact, even as they had collectively hoped it would never come in this form. The first question asked was not how do we retaliate. The first question asked was why. That question, why, would consume the intelligence apparatus of every spacefaring human institution for the next 9 months, and it would never receive a satisfying answer. But the working theories that emerged from those 9 months shaped every decision that followed, and they deserve careful examination. Theory 1, the Calvari attacks were a test. A probe of human response capabilities and military thresholds. The choice of soft targets, agricultural stations, schools, medical facilities, could be interpreted as a deliberate attempt to measure emotional reaction rather than tactical resistance. How quickly did humanity respond? What assets did it deploy? Did it attempt communication or immediate retaliation? Theory 2. The Calvari did not recognize the settlements as belonging to a unified species. The spread of human colonization across the Kashan expanse was recent enough, and dispersed enough, that the 4 targeted sites might have appeared to be separate civilizations, small, isolated, potentially unaffiliated. Under this theory, the Calvari were not attacking humanity. They were clearing land. Theory 3, the one that troubled analysts most deeply because it was the most parsimonious, was that the Calvari had recognized humanity perfectly well. That the targeting of children was not incidental. That something in Calvari culture, psychology, or military doctrine assigned specific strategic or symbolic meaning to the elimination of a civilization's young. No consensus was reached. What was reached instead was a decision. UNSC Admiral Priya Vasanthan, who would later become the most written about military figure of her generation, presented a single document to the emergency session on the 9th day of deliberation. It was not a battle plan. It was a framework, a structured approach to a situation that had no clean precedent in human history. She called it the Rethka Response Protocol, and its opening paragraph contained a sentence that would later be carved into the memorial wall at UNSC headquarters on Luna. We do not yet know what the Calvari are, what they want, or whether they are capable of reason. We know only what they have done. Our response must be proportionate not to our grief, but to our understanding, and our understanding must be pursued with the same rigor we would apply to any military problem, even as that pursuit delays what many in this room believe is justice. The protocol had 3 phases. Phase 1, intelligence. Locate the Calvari. Understand their origin, their capabilities, their communication structure. Find out why. Phase 2, contact. Make one more attempt, a serious, structured, unambiguous attempt, to establish communication. Not because humanity owed the Calvari dialogue after what they had done, but because the alternative had consequences that needed to be entered into the calculation honestly. Phase 3. If Phase 2 failed or if the Calvari acted again before Phase 2 could be completed, humanity would respond. Not with rage. Not with a gesture. With considered, documented, deliberate force. The session voted unanimously to adopt the protocol. Outside the chamber, in the corridors of the UNSC building, people were less measured. The feeds were full of the names of the dead. Parents were holding photographs. Rethka had become a word that meant something now. Not a moon, not a settlement, not a coordinate on a star chart. A reason. Phase 1 began the following morning. 47 deep-range scout vessels launched from 5 separate staging points across the Kashan expanse, burning hard toward the outer transit corridors where the Calvari fleet had last been tracked. They were going to find them. And then humanity was going to decide, carefully, deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost, what to say. Deep space reconnaissance is not a glamorous assignment. The crews of the 47 scout vessels that departed the Kashan expanse in the first week of what the UNSC would later designate Operation Quiet Glass understood this when they signed on. They flew modified long-range survey craft, the kind normally used for stellar cartography and resource mapping, stripped of comfort fittings and loaded with passive sensor arrays, signal intercept packages, and enough fuel to run dark for 6 months without resupply. No active emissions. No transponders. No communication bursts that could betray their positions to whatever was waiting in the transit corridors beyond the expanse's outer boundary. 14 of those vessels would return with actionable data. 9 would not return at all. The transit corridor designated TC-7, informally called the Pale Run by survey crews because of the unusual concentration of white dwarf remnants along its length, had been mapped in broad strokes during the 3rd decade of human interstellar expansion. It was not a commonly used route. The geometry was inconvenient for commercial hauling, the radiation environment required additional hull shielding, and there was simply nothing at the far end that justified the expense. The surveys had noted the corridor and moved on. What scout vessel ISV Meridian Reach found when it entered TC-7 on day 31 of its deployment was not in any of those surveys. Lieutenant Commander Seo Yunji logged the contact at 0612 hours in her ship's private record, a compressed notation that her crew's standing orders required to be transmitted only on physical return, never broadcast. The notation read, TC-7, Deep Anchor Point, bearing 220 Mark 17. Structure or structures of artificial origin. Size estimate pending calibration, but preliminary scan suggests scale exceeding any human installation in the expanse. No active emissions detected. Passive thermal reads warm. Something is home. The Meridian Reach spent 11 days in TC-7. Commander CO did not bring her ship close. She was experienced enough to know that the difference between intelligence gathering and triggering a response was often a matter of distance and patience. She ran her passive sensors from the corridor's shadow edge, a position that gave her partial data and cost her nothing in detection risk. What she assembled over those 11 days was incomplete, but it was enough. The Kalvari had a base in the Pale Run. Not a fleet anchorage. Not a temporary staging point. A permanent installation, or something as close to permanent as the term could mean for a species that had apparently crossed hundreds of light years to reach the Kashan expanse. It was built into a captured asteroid body, the kind of construction that took years of dedicated effort. There were heat signatures consistent with industrial process. There was structured electromagnetic activity consistent with communications infrastructure. There were vessel signatures, larger than the 14 that had attacked the settlements and more numerous. CO counted 31 ship-class contacts before her sensor suite reached its reliability threshold. She turned her vessel around and began the transit home. 3 other scout teams returned with corroborating data from adjacent transit corridors. Smaller contacts, possible forward observation posts, consistent with the profile of a species that had been watching the Kashan expanse for some time before making its first move. One team, the crew of ISV Harrow Point, had encountered a single Kalvari vessel in open transit and been detected. Their record, recovered from an emergency capsule found drifting near the expanse boundary 6 weeks later, showed the contact had lasted approximately 4 minutes before their ship's systems went silent. There was no wreckage. The Harrow Point simply stopped transmitting. This was noted in the intelligence summary that reached Admiral Vasanthan's desk. It was not dramatized. It was entered into the record alongside the sensor data and the tactical assessments and the slowly growing picture of what humanity was dealing with. What it was dealing with, the picture suggested, was not a civilization acting impulsively. The installation in TC-7 was too deliberate for impulse. The apparent surveillance activity was too patient. Whatever the Kalvari had done to the settlements of the Kashan expanse, however it read from a human moral standpoint, it did not look, from an intelligence standpoint, like random violence. It looked like a process. That distinction frightened the analysts more than the body count had. The xenolinguistics team had been working in parallel, and their preliminary report landed in the same intelligence package as CO's reconnaissance data. The report ran to 847 pages and contained an honest admission in its executive summary. They had almost nothing. The Kalvari's electromagnetic profile suggested a communication system that operated on principles the team could describe mathematically but not semantically decode. It was structured. It was clearly information-dense. And it was entirely unlike anything in the existing xenolinguistics literature, which, prior to Rethka, had been entirely theoretical. What they had found, however, was a pattern. In the electromagnetic noise captured during each of the 4 settlement attacks, there was a brief signal burst immediately before weapons deployment. Always the same duration. Always on the same frequency. Always the same basic structure, though the content varied slightly each time. The team's leading interpretation, stated with appropriate uncertainty, was that it was a declaration of some kind. Not a warning to the people on the surface. An outward broadcast. Something being transmitted not at the settlements but away from them, toward deep space, toward whatever institutional or command structure the Kalvari reported to. If that interpretation was correct, then someone was being told about the attacks in real time. Someone was authorizing them or being informed of them or both. This changed the strategic picture considerably. A rogue fleet acting without oversight was one kind of problem. A coordinated military action being reported up a chain of command was another. The second implied a decision-making structure that could, in theory, be reached. It also implied that whoever sat at the top of that structure had already been told, for separate times, what was happening in the Kashan expanse, and had not stopped it. Admiral Vasanthan read the full intelligence package in a single sitting. She was known among her staff for reading everything herself, without summaries, a habit she had developed as a junior officer after a condensed briefing had cost a patrol wing 3 vessels because a single qualifying sentence had been edited out for length. She read CO's reconnaissance logs. She read the Harrow Point record. She read the xenolinguistics report from the first page to the last. Then she sat for a long time before writing anything. What she wrote, when she finally turned to her terminal, was a 7-page addendum to the Rethka response protocol. It addressed a scenario that the original document had acknowledged but not fully planned for: the possibility that the Calvari were not a frontier element acting in isolation, but a forward component of something larger. The addendum did not change Phase 1 or Phase 2. The intelligence gathering would continue. The contact attempt would still be made. But it significantly revised Phase 3. The revision was not about escalation. It was about preparation, the kind that takes time, requires coordination, and cannot be undone once set in motion. Vasanthan was not ordering an attack. She was building the infrastructure for one, carefully, with the full understanding that building it was itself a statement about human intent. The addendum went to the Civilian Oversight Committee the following morning. After 3 days of debate, it was approved. Meanwhile, the names continued to accumulate. The initial casualty count from the 4 attacks had been 2,466. As the weeks passed and the medical teams finished their work at each site, identifying remains, accounting for individuals who had been registered as missing, the number climbed. Some had died of injuries in the days after the attacks. Some had been caught in secondary failures. Power systems, life support, medical equipment that had been damaged in the energy discharge. The final confirmed count, released by the Colonial Authority 6 weeks after the last attack, was 3,102 dead. Among them, 2,419 were children. The number was read aloud at the UNSC session where Vasanthan's addendum was approved. It was read by a civilian representative from Rethka who had survived because she had been off-site at a supply station when the attack came. She had lost her daughter in the first strike. She read the number without breaking. Then she looked at the room, the admirals, the analysts, the diplomats, the strategists, and she said quietly, "Make sure it means something." The room did not applaud. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Admiral Vasanthan said, "Yes, ma'am?" And Phase 1 continued. The Calvari returned 14 months after Draker. The intelligence teams had not predicted the timing precisely. They had modeled a range of scenarios with return windows spread across a 2-year probability band, but they had predicted the targets. Not the specific settlements but the type. The pattern from the first 4 attacks had held up under sustained analysis. Soft infrastructure, civilian density, minimal defensive capability. The Calvari, whatever else they were not interested in engaging human military assets. Every installation UNSC had in the Kashan expanse, the patrol stations, the logistics depots, the 2 forward operating bases built in the months since Rethka, had been left untouched. They were not attacking humanity's ability to fight. They were attacking humanity's willingness to stay. That interpretation, first proposed by behavioral analyst Dr. Marcus Osei of the UNSC Strategic Studies Division, had become the working consensus by the time the second wave arrived. The Calvari were not trying to destroy human civilization. They were trying to make the Kashan expanse uninhabitable for humans, not through ecological damage or infrastructure destruction, but through the oldest strategic tool available to any species, the targeting of the irreplaceable. You don't have to destroy a civilization's soldiers to make it retreat. You make it afraid to bring its children. The second wave comprised 7 vessels. Different from the first, smaller individual ships, but deployed across a wider geographic spread of the expanse, hitting 5 settlements in a coordinated sequence that unfolded over 48 hours. The settlements were Corinth Station, the Veld communities on Paran 3, New Halcyon, Myra's Rest, and the Sundowner Agricultural Cooperative. UNSC had positioned fast response patrol wings near several of the expanse's higher population sites. 2 of those wings engaged Calvari vessels, the first time human military assets had directly confronted the enemy. The engagements lasted, respectively, 6 minutes and 11 minutes. Both patrol wings were destroyed. Not routed. Not driven off. Destroyed, all vessels, all crew, with an efficiency that the post-action analysis described as reflecting significant advantage in both weapons range and targeting response time. The Calvari ships that were engaged absorbed hits from UNSC kinetic and directed energy weapons, showed damage consistent with those hits, and continued their attack runs regardless. This was new information. Painful information. But it was information. At Corinth Station, the attack came at local morning, again. The time correlation across all 5 second-wave sites would later be noted as significant. Every attack was conducted during what sensor analysis identified as peak residential activity for each settlement's specific time zone. The Calvari were not hitting randomly within a window. They were timing their strikes for maximum civilian presence. At Corinth, 614 people died. At the Veld communities, 487. New Halcyon, which had managed a partial evacuation after receiving the emergency signal from Corinth, Lost 203, the evacuation saving an estimated 800 lives that would otherwise have been lost. The partial success of that evacuation would later be studied extensively as a model for what was possible with even a few hours of warning. Myra's Rest, which received the warning too late and had no evacuation assets, lost 1,139 people. Sundowner lost 78. The cooperative had a volunteer defense coordinator who had, on his own initiative, arranged a dispersal protocol in the months since Draker. When the alarm reached them, the population scattered into the agricultural outbuildings and underground irrigation infrastructure rather than gathering in the central settlement hall. It saved most of them. The coordinator, a retired survey technician named Bram Holt, died in the initial strike. He had stayed at the alarm station to make sure the signal reached everyone. The UNSC awarded him the Colonial Defense Cross posthumously. His family received it at a ceremony on Paran 6 months later. His daughter, who was 9 years old, held the medal and didn't fully understand what it meant yet. She would, when she grew up. She would understand it very well. The second wave brought the total casualty count to 5,731 dead. Among them, 4,108 were children. The number was not announced with ceremony. It appeared in a UNSC public release, formatted in the same clean bureaucratic type as every other official communication, because the institution had made a deliberate decision early in the conflict to be precise and transparent about the cost rather than to manage the public's emotional response. People had a right to know what was happening. They had a right to the real numbers. The real numbers were devastating. In the weeks following the second wave, something shifted in the public conversation about the conflict. And the shift was not what some of the more cautious voices in the UNSC had feared. There were no riots. There were no demands for immediate, unstructured retaliation. What emerged instead was something quieter and more durable, a kind of collective settling. A recognition that had moved past grief and was looking at the situation with open eyes. Human civilization had been in the Kashan expanse for 40 years. It had built communities there, imperfect, sometimes struggling but real. People had been born in those settlements. People had decided that the outer edge of human space was where they wanted to raise their families. And something had come from the dark and attacked those families, methodically, twice, without explanation or warning or any apparent interest in alternatives. The public did not need to be told to take this seriously. They already understood. What they wanted, what the communications that flooded the UNSC's public channels expressed, again and again in different languages and different registers but with a consistent underlying tone, was competence. Not vengeance. Not a promise of overwhelming force. They wanted to know that the people responsible for this problem had genuinely understood its nature and were responding to that nature with everything available to them. Admiral Vasanthan addressed a public session of the UN General Assembly 10 days after the second wave's casualties were confirmed. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes. She described, with the precision of a career officer and the accessibility of someone who understood that the room included people from every background, exactly what was known about the Kalvari, exactly what was not known, and exactly what UNSC intended to do. She did not promise victory. She did not claim that humanity's resolve was greater than the enemy's capability. She described a measured, phased response to a documented threat, and she acknowledged honestly that Phase 2, the contact attempt, had not succeeded, because the contact attempt required finding a way to communicate with an entity that had not yet demonstrated any interest in receiving communication. "We are still trying," she said. "We will continue trying until the evidence tells us we have exhausted that option." That is not weakness. That is how rational actors behave when the alternative is a war we do not yet fully understand. Then she paused and said, "But we are also preparing. And we are ready to execute." The session was broadcast across the settled systems. The clip of that final statement was shared so widely that it became, within days, the most viewed public communication in colonial history. Not because of the content, though the content mattered. Because of how she said it. Flat. Certain. Without performance. The tone of someone who had done the math and was not afraid of the answer. Phase 2 reached its conclusion 3 weeks later. The xenolinguistics team, working with the signal data gathered from the second wave attacks and a new mathematical framework developed in collaboration with 3 university research groups, had constructed what they cautiously described as a functional unidirectional message in Kalvari electromagnetic format. They could not guarantee it would be understood. They could not guarantee it would be received by anyone with decision-making authority. What they could say was that it was the most rigorously constructed attempt humanity had ever made to communicate across a total language barrier, and that it had been reviewed by every qualified analyst available and found to be structurally sound. The message was transmitted from 5 separate relay points in the Kashyyyk expanse, on the Kalvari communication frequency, in the Kalvari signal format, toward the TC-7 installation that Meridian Reach had located. The content of the message was brief. It identified humanity as the civilization resident in the Kashyyyk expanse. It documented the attacks with coordinates and timestamps. It noted the casualty figures. And it asked, in the clearest mathematical and logical structures the linguists could construct, a single question. What? 30 days passed. No response came. At the end of the 30-day window, Admiral Vasanthan submitted a formal determination to the Civilian Oversight Committee. Phase 2 was complete. The attempt had been made in good faith with full effort and had received no answer. The committee deliberated for 6 hours. Then they voted. Phase 3 authorization was granted at 2,247 hours, Colonial Standard Time. In the shipyards of 6 different systems, work that had been progressing under Phase 3 preparation protocols for the past 8 months accelerated into its final stage. Humanity was not going to hit back in anger. It was not going to make a gesture. It was going to respond, carefully, deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost and the stakes and the consequences, with a message of its own. And this one would be impossible to misunderstand. The construction logs for what would eventually be designated Task Force Meridian are publicly available in the UNSC Historical Archive, and they make for unusual reading. Most military procurement documentation is dry. Line items, material specifications, contractor codes, delivery schedules. The Meridian construction logs contain all of that. They also contain, interspersed throughout the technical data, a series of brief personal entries from the yard supervisors and shift commanders at each of the 6 construction sites. These entries were not required. They appear to have been written voluntarily, a quiet record kept by people who understood that what they were building was not ordinary, and who felt, perhaps, that it deserved to be witnessed. A yard supervisor at the Callisto installation named Petra Vance wrote, on the 200th day of construction, "Third shift worked 16 hours today without a break request. I asked Tomasz why they were pushing so hard. He showed me the wall." The wall she was referring to was a practice that had begun spontaneously at the Callisto yard and spread to all 6 sites within weeks. A section of the construction facility's interior wall, near the main entrance, where workers had begun printing the names of the Rethka dead. All of them. In small type, to fit as many as possible, updated as the casualty lists were finalized and certified. By the time Vance wrote her entry, the wall at Callisto stretched 40 meters. The names of 4,108 children were on it. People walked past that wall at the start and end of every shift. Nobody had asked them to. Nobody had suggested it as a motivational technique. It simply existed because the people building Task Force Meridian had decided, collectively and without discussion, that they wanted to know what they were working for. Task Force Meridian, in its final configuration, comprised 31 vessels. This was not a number chosen arbitrarily. When the Meridian Reach had counted 31 Kalvari ship-class contacts at the TC-7 installation, Admiral Vasanthan had noted the number and filed it. When the Phase 3 planning teams modeled response scenarios against the available intelligence, 31 became a structural element, not a symbolic match but a practical calculation. The UNSC did not know how many of the TC-7 vessels were combat-capable, what their individual capability profile looked like, or how the Kalvari organized their naval assets. What it knew was that the engagement data from the patrol wing destructions gave it the worst-case combat performance parameters of individual Kalvari vessels, and that 31 purpose-built UNSC warships, designed specifically around those parameters, represented a force that the models suggested could achieve its operational objectives against a full TC-7 deployment. The models were not certainties. They were never presented as certainties. Every briefing document from the Phase 3 planning process contained explicit uncertainty quantification, probability ranges, sensitivity analyses, honest acknowledgement of the gaps in the intelligence picture. This was not bureaucratic caution. It was operational discipline. The people planning Meridian had looked at what happened to the patrol wings and understood that assuming superiority was how you got people killed. What the 31 vessels represented was a serious, prepared, calibrated effort, not a guarantee. The ships themselves were not revolutionary. This is worth noting because the popular narrative that developed around Task Force Meridian in the years after the operation tended toward mythologizing the hardware. The vessels were not miraculous. They were the product of 8 months of intensive work by human engineers who had been given clear requirements, adequate resources, and the operational data from the patrol wing engagements. The requirements were specific. The Calvari ships had demonstrated extended weapons range. UNSC patrol craft had been destroyed before they could achieve effective return fire distance. The solution was not to match Calvari range immediately, which the engineering teams assessed as infeasible in the available timeline. The solution was to accept the range disadvantage and compensate with two factors: speed of approach through the Calvari standoff envelope, and coordinated fire architecture that required the enemy to manage multiple simultaneous threats rather than engaging targets sequentially. The second factor addressed the Calvari vessels' demonstrated ability to absorb hits and continue operating. The patrol wing data showed that individual UNSC weapons were capable of damaging Calvari ships but not immediately disabling them. The engineering solution was not more powerful individual weapons. Again, infeasible in timeline. It was simultaneous volume. Enough coordinated fire from multiple vessels against a single target that the cumulative effect achieved in seconds what sequential fire achieved over minutes. These were not elegant solutions. They were functional ones. The tactical doctrine built around them was developed by a working group of 12 officers, none of whom had commanded in an actual space engagement before, because humanity had never had an actual space engagement before. They worked from first principles, from the engagement data, from historical studies of naval combat in ocean environments, and from an honest accounting of the limits of their own experience. The doctrine went through 47 revision cycles before Admiral Vasanthan signed off on it. While the yards built and the planners planned, Phase 2 was still technically active, and the intelligence effort continued in parallel. Two things emerged from that continued effort that materially affected the Meridian planning. The first was a more refined understanding of the TC-7 installation's layout and defensive profile, assembled through careful ongoing passive reconnaissance by a rotation of scout vessels operating in the Pale Run's shadow geometry. The installation was large, but its vessel deployment pattern had a structure to it. The larger ship class contacts were not distributed randomly around the asteroid body but concentrated toward what appeared to be a primary docking face. This was significant tactically, because a concentrated deployment meant the Calvari vessels would need time to disperse from their docking positions before they could bring their full force to bear on an incoming threat. That dispersion window was estimated at 12 to 18 minutes. 12 to 18 minutes was the kind of tactical information that changed plans. The second development was less quantifiable but arguably more important for everything that came after. The xenolinguistics team, continuing to analyze the signal bursts recorded during the settlement attacks, had made a new observation. The outward transmission that preceded each attack, the one they had interpreted as a declaration or reporting mechanism, was not, as they had originally assumed, a single standard message repeated each time. Each transmission was distinct. The mathematical structure varied in ways that correlated with specific characteristics of each attacked settlement: population density, settlement age, infrastructure complexity. The team's updated interpretation: the transmissions were not simply reporting the attacks. They were reporting assessments. The Calvari were sending detailed analytical data about each target, before destroying it. To whom? For what purpose? The team didn't know. But the implication was disturbing in a specific way. It suggested that whatever the TC-7 installation represented, it was not the top of the Calvari command structure. It was reporting upward to something further out, something the reconnaissance had not yet found. This information reached Vasanthan's desk 43 days before the planned Meridian launch date. She read it twice. Then she wrote a single annotation in the operational planning file: TC-7 is not the end of this. Plan accordingly. She did not change the launch date. She did not scale back the operation. But she added a mission parameter that had not been in the original Phase 3 authorization. Every Meridian vessel would carry a full intelligence collection suite, and its secondary mission, running parallel to the primary tactical objective, was to gather every piece of data available about what TC-7 was, how it functioned, and where it connected to. The fight at TC-7, if it came to a fight, was not going to be humanity's last statement on the matter. It was going to be humanity's opening statement. Loud, clear, and accompanied by as much information as possible about the conversation that still needed to happen. The task force assembled at a staging point in the outer Cashan expanse designated Anchor 0, over a period of 9 days, as vessels completed their final system certifications and transit from the construction yards. On the 6th day of assembly, with 22 of the 31 vessels present, the staging point received a long-range sensor contact. A Calvari vessel, single deep transit signature, moving through the outer corridor near TC-7. Not moving toward Anchor 0. passing at significant distance, on a heading that might or might not have brought it within long-range sensor range of the assembled fleet. Standing orders were clear. No engagement outside the operational context. No active emissions that could betray the assembly point. Every commander at Anchor 0 held position and held silence. The Calvari vessel continued on its heading and disappeared into transit. Whether it had detected the fleet or missed it or detected it and noted it without reaction, no one knew. The uncertainty was entered into the operational log and left there, an open variable that couldn't be resolved before launch. On the 9th day, the 31st vessel completed docking protocols. Task Force Meridian was assembled. Admiral Vasanthan transmitted a brief message to all 31 commanding officers. It was not a speech. It was a statement of operational parameters, a reminder of the rules of engagement, which were specific, binding, and included explicit provisions about proportionality and the treatment of any non-combatant contacts, and a single closing sentence. We are not going there to prove something. We are going there to end something, or to begin, finally, the conversation that should have started before a single life was lost. Launch was set for 0600 hours. At 0557, someone on the flagship's bridge, no one ever admitted who, cued a single piece of music through the internal comm, an old piece from Earth. Quiet, instrumental. Something from before the colonial era. It played for 3 minutes. At 0600, Task Force Meridian entered transit. Transit through TC-7 took 19 hours. 19 hours in which 31 vessels ran dark. No active sensors, no communication, minimal power signatures, navigating by pre-calculated trajectory rather than active positioning. In the cramped operational spaces of each ship, the crews prepared. Systems checks that had already been completed 3 times were completed again. Tactical assignments were reviewed until they were reflex. Medical teams staged their equipment. Everyone ate, because experienced officers had learned that people made worse decisions when they were hungry and nobody could predict when the next opportunity would come. Nobody slept much. Not because they were afraid, though some were, and that was honest and appropriate. Because they were thinking. Every person on those 31 vessels carried the same knowledge, understood the same stakes, had walked past versions of the same wall. They thought about what they were doing and why, and when they were done thinking about it, they felt ready. Task Force Meridian exited transit at 0312 hours, 17 light minutes from the TC-7 installation. At 0313, the fleet's passive sensor arrays confirmed the installation's presence at the expected coordinates. Thermal signatures consistent with previous reconnaissance. Electromagnetic activity at normal operational levels. The installation was awake and functioning. At 0314, the first active sensor sweep went out. Vasanthan had made a specific decision about this. The Meridian approach was not designed to achieve surprise in the tactical sense, sneaking to within weapons range before the Calvari knew they were there. It was designed to achieve surprise in the strategic sense, arriving in force in a form the Calvari had not seen before, with a clearly communicated intent that gave the installation's command structure a choice before the fighting started. The active sensor sweep was the announcement. It said, "We are here, we know where you are, and we are not hiding." 3 minutes later, the fleet's communication systems broadcast a signal on the Calvari frequency, in the Calvari format, using the mathematical framework the linguists had developed. It was a modified version of the Phase 2 message. The same identification, the same casualty documentation, with one addition. The addition was an offer. If the installation transmitted a response indicating willingness to communicate, Task Force Meridian would hold position and wait. Vasanthan gave it 20 minutes. At 0337, no response had been received. At 0338, the Calvari installation began launching vessels. What followed over the next 4 hours and 22 minutes has been analyzed in detail in the UNSC official operational record, in 12 separate academic studies, and in the proceedings of 3 different professional military education programs. It is well documented. The summary is clean. Task Force Meridian engaged a total of 26 Calvari combat vessels and destroyed 22 of them. 4 Calvari vessels achieved transit escape, their trajectories logged for subsequent analysis. The TC-7 installation itself was engaged after the vessel battle, its docking infrastructure disabled with targeted strikes designed to eliminate military capability without destroying the installation entirely. The summary is clean. What it doesn't capture is the texture of the 4 hours and 22 minutes. The first engagements confirmed the patrol wing data and validated the Meridian tactical doctrine. At extended range, the Calvari weapons were lethal. The ISV Koronek took a direct hit during the first minute of the engagement that destroyed 2 of its 4 propulsion units and killed 11 of its crew. It stayed in the fight. Its commander, Lieutenant Commander Adiz Nwosu, redistributed the vessel's thrust geometry and continued executing its assigned tactical role with 3 propulsion units and her damage control teams working in a compartment that was venting atmosphere. The Koronek would survive the engagement. She would reach a repair facility 8 weeks later with a crew of 71, having launched with a crew of 82. Nwosu would receive the Colonial Star. She would, at the ceremony, say that the award belonged to the 11 who didn't come home, because they had stayed at their stations long enough to confirm the targeting solution that the Koronek strike contributed to in the opening exchange. This kind of thing happened 11 times across the task force. 11 vessels took significant damage. 3 took catastrophic hits and were unable to continue tactical operations. 1, the ISV Harkin Bridge, was destroyed with all hands when it was caught in a concentrated fire pattern from 3 Kalvari vessels simultaneously. 43 crew aboard the Harkin Bridge. All lost. This too is part of the record. The coordinated fire architecture worked. Not perfectly, tactical doctrine never works perfectly the first time it encounters actual combat. But the core principle held. When 3 or 4 Meridian vessels concentrated fire on a single Kalvari target, the target's ability to continue operating degraded faster than it could be compensated for. The Kalvari ships were capable, well-armored, and handled by competent crews. They were not invincible. Nothing is invincible when enough well-directed force is applied quickly enough. The 12 to 18-minute dispersion window that reconnaissance had identified proved accurate. The initial Kalvari vessel launches from the docking face came in sequence, not simultaneously, and Meridian's positioning allowed the task force to engage the early launches before the full installation complement was in space. This was the tactical advantage that made the outcome possible. Not superior technology, not invulnerable ships, not some unique human characteristic that defied the odds. Preparation. Intelligence. The careful, unglamorous work of understanding your problem before you tried to solve it. The intelligence collection mission ran in parallel throughout. While the combat elements of each vessel's crew executed the tactical operation, the collection suites ran continuously, recording everything: Kalvari communication traffic, vessel performance data, the installation's internal systems activity as it responded to the engagement. The collection teams were not involved in the fighting. Their job was to watch and record, and they did it with the focused attention of people who understood that what they were capturing might matter more in the long run than the outcome of the battle itself. What they captured, in the final 40 minutes of the engagement, was significant. The installation began transmitting on an outward channel, not toward the Meridian fleet, not on the communication frequencies the linguists had analyzed. A deeper range transmission, using a modulation format different from anything previously recorded. Long burst. High information density. Clearly not a tactical communication. It was reporting to something further out. The collection teams logged every second of it. The linguists who would later analyze the transmission would spend 3 years on it before producing a confident partial interpretation. What they eventually concluded was that the TC-7 installation had sent, in those final 40 minutes, a detailed account of the engagement, the fleet size, its tactical approach, its weapons capabilities, the outcome of the battle as it unfolded in real time. Someone far away was being told, with precision and detail, what humanity had just done. Someone was taking note. At 0800 hours, the installation's docking infrastructure was disabled. The strikes were precise. The objective was to eliminate the capability to rapidly redeploy combat vessels, not to destroy the installation itself. Visanthan's rules of engagement were specific on this point, and the crews executing the strikes followed them with the discipline that comes from understanding why the rules exist. After the strikes, Meridian broadcast one final message on the Kalvari frequency. It was not a declaration of victory. It was a statement. In the same mathematical framework the linguists had built, with the same identification and the same casualty documentation that had been sent before, it said, "We came here because you gave us no other option. We are still capable of communication. We are still willing to talk. But we will not be passive while you decide." Then Task Force Meridian held position for 2 hours, sensors active, collection suites running, weapon systems on standby. No response came from the installation. At 1000 hours, Visanthan gave the order to begin transit home. The 4 Kalvari vessels that had escaped into transit were already gone, their trajectory data suggesting a heading toward the deeper transit corridors where the preliminary signal analysis pointed to something larger than TC-7. They were carrying a very specific piece of information. Humanity had found them. Humanity had come prepared. And humanity had, in the middle of a fight, still tried to talk. What the Calvari would do with that information was the question that would define everything that came next. The word, emperor, is a human translation. This requires acknowledgement because the concept it was applied to, the Calvari governmental structure that would eventually become relevant to the events following TC7, was not a monarchy in any human sense. The linguists who worked with the transmission data recovered by the Meridian collection teams, and who eventually developed the first functional bidirectional communication framework with the Calvari, settled on emperor because it was the closest available term for an entity that combined executive decision-making authority with what appeared to be institutional permanence. The Calvari word, rendered phonetically as something close to Verexol, described a role that was simultaneously political, military, and what might be called cosmological in function. The Verexol was the entity that the TC7 installation had been reporting to. It took humanity 3 years to understand this. It took another 2 years to establish the communication channel that made the understanding actionable. In those 5 years much happened, most of it careful, patient, unglamorous work by linguists, diplomats, intelligence analysts, and military strategists who understood that the fight at TC7 had not ended the conflict. It had changed it. In the months immediately following Meridian's return, the UNSC and the UN civilian structures entered a period that internal documents describe simply as assessment. The operational record was reviewed in detail. The intelligence collected during the engagement was analyzed. The 4 escaped Calvari vessels were tracked as far as possible, through their transit trajectories. The data was imprecise, but it pointed consistently toward a deep space region that the survey records designated the Venn sector, a part of the galaxy that human long-range astronomy had categorized and largely ignored because it contained no resources of immediate interest. Reconnaissance was dispatched. Carefully. With full awareness of what had happened to the Harrow Point. What came back, over the following 18 months, was a picture of scale that required significant adjustment in humanity's assessment of its own position. The TC7 installation had been a forward deployment. Not the primary military capacity of a small civilization, but a scouting and assessment element of something substantially larger. The Venn sector contained, as best the reconnaissance could determine from passive observation at extreme distances, what appeared to be a home system or major population center, with a space presence that dwarfed anything humanity had built in the Kashan expanse by an order of magnitude. The Calvari were not a small civilization having a territorial dispute with a newly encountered neighbor. They were an old, large, capable civilization, and the Kashan expanse was apparently within a region they considered relevant to their interests. This assessment was delivered to the Civilian Oversight Committee with the same precision and honesty that had characterized every previous briefing. It was not softened. The implication was clear. Task Force Meridian had been a statement, and it had been a credible one, but it was not a deterrent in any permanent sense. Humanity had demonstrated capacity and resolve. It had not demonstrated superiority. What it needed to demonstrate next, the Civilian Committee concluded, was something harder to build than a fleet. Legitimacy. The communication effort that followed TC7 was the most complex intellectual project humanity had ever attempted. It built on the linguist's existing framework, on the transmission data from the engagement, and on new data from a source that surprised everyone. The TC7 installation itself, which the Meridian strikes had disabled but not destroyed, and which, after a period of apparent dormancy, had resumed low-level electromagnetic emissions that the reconnaissance teams were able to monitor. The installation was still occupied. Whatever staff had survived the engagement were still there, apparently continuing some form of operations. They were not transmitting toward humanity. They were transmitting toward the Venn sector, in the same outward reporting format that had been observed before. The linguists worked with those transmissions alongside everything they had previously collected, building a cumulative model of Calvari communication structure that grew more refined with each new data point. After 2 years of work, the model was functional enough that they could construct messages with reasonable confidence in their semantic content. Not perfect understanding but enough to convey specific, unambiguous concepts. The first message constructed with the new framework was not sent immediately. It was debated, revised, debated again, and reviewed by a committee that included linguists, diplomats, military strategists, ethicists, and representatives of the families of the dead from all 9 attacked settlements. That last group's involvement was not procedural. They had been invited because the committee had decided, early in the process, that the people who had paid the heaviest cost in this conflict had a right to be present when humanity decided what to say next. Their contributions to the message were not technical. They were moral. They pushed back on language that read in the committee's early drafts as adversarial posturing. They pushed for language that was clear about what humanity had experienced without being constructed around that experience as a rhetorical weapon. They wanted the message to communicate reality, not argument. One of those representatives, the woman from Rethka who had told the UNSC to make it mean something, and whose daughter's name was on the wall at Callisto, said during the final review session, "Don't talk to them like you're trying to win. Talk to them like you're trying to stop losing." The message was revised one final time after that session. The transmission went out on year 3, month 4 after TC7. It was sent on the outward reporting frequency that the TC7 installation used, the deep-range channel aimed at the Venn sector. Not at TC7 itself. Past it. Toward whatever the installation had been reporting to. The message identified humanity, documented the settlement attacks, documented TC7, and then did something the earlier messages hadn't done. It asked a specific question. Not why. That question had gone unanswered and its function had been served. The new question was structural. In the mathematical framework the linguists had built, it asked as precisely as they could formulate, who decides? Not an accusation. Not a rhetorical device. A genuine request for information about the Calvari decision-making structure, the most important piece of context missing from humanity's understanding of what was happening. Who decides meant, is this a policy or is this a rogue action? Is there a structure we can reach? Is there an entity with the authority to make different choices? The question sat in the transmission corridors for 8 months before an answer came. When the answer came, it did not come in the expected form. It came as a narrow-beam transmission, directed precisely at the TC7 installation, from a source in the Venn sector. The installation wasn't the intended recipient, or perhaps it was as an intermediary. Either way, the UNSC reconnaissance assets monitoring the installation's communications caught the transmission. It was not a reply to humanity's message in the conventional sense. It was a response to the question, to the structural inquiry about who decides. And it used, in its response, the same mathematical framework that humanity's linguists had developed, with modifications that suggested the transmitting entity had analyzed humanity's communication model and adapted to it. The Varric soul, the emperor, the decision-making authority at the top of the Calvari structure, was communicating. Not with humanity directly. Not yet. But through the TC7 channel, using a modified version of the human linguistic framework, in a way that was clearly deliberate. The message was brief and, after 18 months of work by the translation team, interpretable. It said, approximately, the question is received. The arrivals at the near systems were assessments of unclassified space. The entity that questions is classified. Unclassified space. The linguists spent considerable time on this phrase. Their best interpretation was that the Kashan expanse had not, prior to the TC7 engagement, been formally recognized by the Calvari as belonging to an established civilization. The settlements were treated as unoccupied or unclaimed, not because the Calvari were unaware of their existence, but because humanity had not been classified in their institutional framework. Classified meant recognized. Acknowledged, given a formal status in the structure that governed Calvari territorial decisions. The TC7 engagement, the arrival of a coordinated military force, the demonstrated capacity for organized response, the repeated attempts at communication before and during the engagement, had triggered a classification review. The Varric soul was, in whatever process their system used, now engaged with the question of what humanity was. This was not peace. It was not an apology. It was not an admission of wrongdoing. 5,731 people were still dead, and nothing that came through a communication channel could change that. But it was the first indication, in years of conflict, that somewhere at the far end of this situation was an entity capable of making different decisions, and that this entity had, for the first time, directly engaged with the fact of humanity's existence. The committee that received the translation report met for 3 days. At the end of the 3 days, they approved a response that had been drafted jointly by the linguists, the diplomats, and the family's representatives. The response said, "We are classified. We remember what was done before you classified us." 5 years, 4 months, and 11 days after the first strike on Rethka. That is the timestamp on the document that the UN Diplomatic Directorate officially titled the Kashan Accords, and that everyone who had lived through the preceding years simply called, without particular ceremony, the agreement. It was not a peace treaty in the traditional sense. There had been no formal state of declared war to end, no front lines to dissolve, no territory to return. It was something more like a mutual recognition framework, a structured acknowledgement negotiated over 14 months of carefully mediated communication, of what each civilization was, what the other civilization was, and what the rules of engagement between them would be going forward. The Accords did not include a Calvari apology for the settlement attacks. This was a point of significant public debate, and the families of the dead were divided on it. Some felt its absence was a failure of the process. Others accepted that pushing for formal admission of wrongdoing from a civilization that operated on entirely different concepts of culpability and responsibility would have collapsed the negotiation before it produced anything. The diplomatic team's position, stated plainly in their operational record, was that a functional framework for preventing future attacks was worth more than a linguistic gesture whose meaning across the cultural divide could not be fully verified. The Accords did include a formal cessation of Calvari activity in the Kashan Expanse and an agreed boundary definition. They included a communication protocol, a structured process for contact before any activity by either civilization in regions near that boundary. They included, at the insistence of the family's representatives, a specific clause that documented the 9 attacked settlements by name, the casualty figures and the dates, not as accusation but as record. The Verexol's acceptance of this clause was interpreted by the linguistic team as significant. In Calvari institutional framework, formally documenting an event in a boundary agreement was a form of permanent acknowledgement that could not be subsequently denied. The names were in the Accords. They would not be erased from Calvari record. Admiral Vasanthan attended the ceremony at which the Accords were formally transmitted. The human side of the exchange was conducted via deep-range communication, there being no agreed protocol for a physical meeting, and no particular appetite on either side for the risks that entailed. She stood in the UNSC Communication Center on Luna, in dress uniform, and watched the transmission go out. She had aged visibly in 5 years. People who had known her before Rethka noted this. She had been fit and precise before. She was still both, but there was something in the set of her expression that had not been there in the photographs from her earlier career. It was not hardness. She had always been hard in the professional sense, in the way competent officers need to be. It was weight. The specific weight of someone who has been responsible for consequential decisions, has made them as well as they could be made, and has not had the luxury of forgetting what they cost. The 31 vessels of Task Force Meridian had returned with 847 crew members. They had left with 1,022. Vasanthan knew all 175 names. She had made a point of learning them. Not as a gesture but as a discipline. The same discipline that had led her to read everything herself without summaries since early in her career. These were people who had died under her orders, pursuant to decisions she had made. Knowing their names was the minimum. The public response to the Accords was complicated, as it had been throughout the conflict, not polarized in the performative sense that early media coverage had sometimes suggested it might become, but genuinely divided along lines of genuine disagreement. There were people who felt the Accords were insufficient. That the asymmetry of the deaths, 5,731 human civilians, the vast majority of them children, against a Calvari military force that had sustained losses in a single military engagement, was not reflected in the outcome, and that a framework which treated the two parties as structurally equivalent was a kind of moral failure. These people were not wrong to feel this. They were engaging honestly with a real ethical problem. There were people who felt the Accords were too much, that having engaged in one military action and achieved a communication breakthrough, humanity should have pushed harder, demanded more, used the demonstrated leverage to extract something closer to justice. These people were also engaging honestly with a real strategic assessment, even if it was one the diplomatic team had concluded was likely to produce worse outcomes in practice. And there were people, a significant number, the families of the dead disproportionately represented among them, who felt that the Accords were the correct outcome, not because it was satisfying, but because the alternative was continued conflict with a civilization whose scale humanity did not yet fully understand, and because continued conflict would produce more names on more walls, and because the people who had already lost the most had decided, with clear eyes, that they wanted a framework for something other than war. This was the position that had ultimately shaped the diplomatic approach. Not because the grievance was smaller than the others, but because it was grounded in the same clear-eyed assessment of reality that had characterized every stage of the UNSC's approach since Rethka. Here is what we know, here is what we don't know, here is what we can reasonably expect to achieve, and here is what that costs. The memorials were built in the years that followed. On Rethka, which was resettled after the Accords, people went back because people go back because the act of returning is itself a statement about belonging and about refusal, there was a central memorial in what had been the northern agricultural zone. It was not elaborate. It was a wall, because walls had become the appropriate form, made of the same pale stone that was quarried locally on the moon, inscribed with the names of the dead from all 9 settlements. All 5,731. Arranged not by settlement or date of death but alphabetically, because the families had decided that alphabetical was the most neutral, the most equal, that the first name on the wall and the last name on the wall should not carry more or less weight by virtue of where they appeared. Near the bottom of the wall, under the letter H, there was a name, Bram Holt of Sundowner Cooperative, the retired survey technician who had stayed at the alarm station. His daughter, who was 14 now and had grown up understanding exactly what that medal meant, attended the memorial's dedication ceremony with her mother. She stood in front of her father's name for a long time. Then she turned to her mother and said, "He saved them." Her mother said, "Yes." "Is that enough?" Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's what he had." The Accords did not end the uncertainty. This is perhaps the most important thing to say about them, the thing that gets lost in commemorative framings that give the events a cleanliness they didn't have in the experience of living through them. The Kashan Accords were a functional framework established under conditions of incomplete information, between 2 civilizations that did not fully understand each other, in the aftermath of events that had not been fully reckoned with by either party. The Varrock soul who had received the classification determination and engaged with the communication process was a specific entity making decisions within a specific institutional context. That context was not fully understood. What the TC-7 installation had actually been doing in the Kashan expanse, the full scope of the assessment process that the settlement attacks had apparently been part of, was never explained in the negotiations, and the linguistic framework was not refined enough to press the question to a satisfying conclusion. What humanity knew was what it had always known: the immediate facts, the documented record, the shape of what had happened. Why it had happened remained and would remain for years, a question with several plausible answers and no certain one. What was certain was this: the Kalvari had come and they had acted and humanity had responded, not with paralysis, not with blind rage, not with arrogance about its own invincibility, but with discipline, with preparation, with a sustained commitment to understanding before acting, and with a willingness, in the middle of justified anger, to still reach toward the possibility of something other than permanent war. That willingness had not been a weakness. It had been the thing that made the Accords possible. The schools rebuilt at Rethka, Corinth, and New Halcyon opened within 3 years of the Accords. Ordinary schools, the kind with morning class rotations and agricultural field trips and children learning the names of the stars. The kind that had existed in the Kashan expanse before the killing, and that existed there again after it, because the people of the expanse had decided that the continuity of those things was not naive. It was necessary. It was the point. On the wall of the Rethka school, the new building in the northern zone, positioned where the old school had been, there was a single inscription chosen by the families and approved by the community at a public meeting. It read, "We know what this cost. We are here anyway." Not defiance. Not triumphalism. Something quieter and more durable than either. A statement of fact and a promise. In the UNSC Historical Archive, filed under the operational record of Task Force Meridian and the subsequent diplomatic process, there is a document that most historians eventually encounter but that receives less attention than the tactical reports and diplomatic cables. It is the log of the Xenolinguistics team's final session, the one at which the Kashan Accords language was reviewed for transmission. The session lasted 9 hours. At the end of it, Dr. Yala Konkwo, who had been on the team since before the first Kalvari attack, who had spent 5 years working on the communication framework that made the Accords possible, and who would later describe those years as the most difficult and the most important work I have ever done, wrote a single entry in the team log. It said, "They can hear us now." The question, as always, was whether we had anything worth saying. I think we did. I think the dead would agree, or I hope they would, or I try to. The entry was not intended for publication. It appears in the archive because the log was classified as a historical document and released in full. It is read by people who find it as something close to an accounting. 5,731 people died before anyone listened. And in the end, what made someone listen was not humanity's strength, though strength was part of it. It was not humanity's grief, though grief shaped everything. It was not even humanity's persistence, though persistence mattered. It was humanity's refusal, under conditions of every conceivable pressure, to become something it could not live with afterward. That, perhaps, was the reply the Emperor heard. Not the weapons fire at TC-7. Not the transmission that said "we remember." Those were the words. The reply was in how those words were chosen.